Okay, let's unpack this. Step back with us into early medieval Europe, specifically Ireland in the 9th century. If you're picturing just one single unified Green Isle, well, our sources paint a rather different picture. This was a land incredibly rich in culture, learning, deeply spiritual with its famous monasteries, but also a place where conflict was just, well, part of the landscape.
And what's particularly striking in the material, I think, is that it wasn't a single kingdom like you might find emerging elsewhere in Europe around then. It was a really complex, shifting patchwork of smaller territories. And into this existing dynamic, this powerful external force arrives, and it fundamentally changes things.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is really to use the sources you provided to understand this unique and, frankly, transformative period.
Yeah.
We'll explore that intricate system of local kings, the immense influence of monastic life that was so central to Irish identity, and then, yeah, that profound disruption brought by the Norse Vikings.
Exactly. We're looking at how these different forces didn't just exist side by side, but how they constantly, collided, adapted, and reshaped each other all through the century.
And there are some truly fascinating elements to get into here. The political structure, for one, is unlike what we typically think of for European monarchies of the era. The monasteries weren't just quiet places of prayer, they were centers of learning and pretty significant power brokers. And the Vikings, I mean, they started as these terrifying raiders, but by the end of the century, they were literally building the first cities on the island. It's quite a shift.
It's definitely a story that includes chaos and violence, no doubt about it. But the sources also reveal this remarkable resilience and adaptation on the part of the Irish people.
Okay, so let's start by digging into that political landscape you mentioned. The material calls it a fragmented kingdom. What did that actually, look and feel like in 9th century Ireland?
Well, calling it a single kingdom can be a bit misleading if you're thinking like centralized state. The island was actually divided into numerous tuatha. Think of these as distinct tribal territories, maybe, each ruled by its own its own king.
So dozens, maybe even hundreds of local kings. That sounds complicated.
Exactly. But they weren't completely independent either. There was a hierarchical system, kind of, layers of allegiance. A local would generally owe loyalty, or at least some form of tribute, to an overking, known as a Rir Ruish, often a provincial king. And then right at the top, there was the figure of the Ardri, the High King of Ireland.
The High King. Okay, that title sounds incredibly powerful. Was he like a monarch ruling the whole island then? Like a Charlemagne figure?
Ah, this is where the sources give us a really important insight. The High King, often associated with the ancient symbolic site of Tara, his role was more about symbolic overlordship, not really centralized authority in the way we might expect. His actual power was, well, frequently contested. The records show that during the 9th century, this top position was largely dominated by just a few powerful families, particularly the Uí from both the north and south. And they were often rivals among themselves, fighting for that title.
So definitely not a strong central government uniting everyone. And the source material also brings up something pretty unique about how these kings even came to power, something called tanistry. How did that work?
Ah, yes, tanistry. This is where succession practices differed quite a bit from, say, what would later happen in Norman England. Kingship wasn't strictly hereditary, like it didn't just pass automatically from father to eldest son. Under tanistry, succession was open to a wider royal kin group, the Derb Fine usually.
Okay, so anyone from the ruling family line, roughly speaking, could potentially become king.
Precisely. And contenders from within this eligible kin group, well, they might be elected, sometimes, yes. But just as often, maybe more often, they would fight for dominance, they'd battle it out. So this system, it inherently led to pretty constant competition, shifting alliances, internal feuds between different branches of the royal families. The insight here, I think, is that Irish political power wasn't static or easily predictable. It was in perpetual flux, a constant contest for legitimacy and control, really.
They had constant internal competition.
Mm.
Wow, that must have had huge implications for everything else happening on the island, especially when external threats arrive. Okay, so we have this complex, often unstable, fragmented political structure. Now let's turn to another major force in 9th century Ireland, one that predated the Vikings and was absolutely central, the monasteries. The sources paint them as a beacon of Christian scholarship.
They absolutely were. Monastic life had become incredibly central to Irish culture since, well, way back in the 5th or 6th centuries. By the 9th century, places like Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, Kells, Armagh, these were not just centers of religious devotion. The material shows they were cultural, intellectual, and even political powerhouses.
What kind of scale are we talking about for their activities? What were they actually doing?
Oh, a huge range. Obviously, religious practice was fundamental, prayer services, but they were also vital centers of education. Monks were painstakingly copying and preserving classical texts, Latin texts, Greek sometime, basically saving ancient knowledge in their scriptoria. They were producing these exquisite illuminated manuscripts, like the famous Book of Kells, which is actually dated to around this very era, the late 8th or early 9th century. And crucially for us today, they were keeping detailed yearly records, the annals.
And those annals are just gold for understanding this period, aren't they?
Right. Absolutely vital. I mean, they give us these vivid, sometimes terse, but near contemporaneous accounts of events, year by year. But the sources make another crucial point. These monasteries were not isolated, quiet spiritual retreats just detached from the world.
Right, you said powerhouses, so they were deeply entangled in the secular world.
Very much so. They were often major landowners, controlling vast tracts of land, which meant they were deeply involved in secular politics, just like the kings and nobles. Abbots frequently came from noble families, directly linking the monasteries to the ruling elite, to those same competing dynasties. And here's a fascinating detail the material highlights. Some monasteries even maintained their own militias, their own fighting forces.
Wait, hang on. A monastery with its own armed force. That fundamentally changes the image I had. That's not just monks praying.
It really does, doesn't it? It gives us the insight that their spiritual authority was often backed by real secular power. They were players in the political landscape, not just outside of it. Okay, so we have this unique internal world of Ireland, the fragmented political scene, these powerful, wealthy, monastic centers. And then, as the sources detail, the defining external change of the century arrives.
The coming of the Norse, the Vikings.
Yes, Norsemen, primarily from what is now Norway, initially at least. The sources pinpoint the very first recorded raid on Ireland to the year 795.
Where did they hit first? Do we know?
The material specifies it was on the monastery of Lambay Island. It's just off the coast, near modern Dublin. That attack, it marked the beginning of a wave of Viking activity that would reshape the island.
And what were those initial attacks like in the first few decades, say the early 800s?
The accounts describe them initially as mostly seasonal. Small fleets would arrive, often in spring or summer. They'd launch fast, brutal raids and then leave again before winter. They targeted monasteries specifically because, well, as we said, there were wealthy centers. Lots of gold from reliquaries, silver, valuable manuscripts, livestock, but tragically, also people. Capturing people to sell into slavery was a major part of it.
Just terrifying for the people living there. But the sources mention a shift, don't they? A change in the Viking approach by the 830s, 840s?
Yes, that's right. That's when the activity seems to become much more organized, more sustained. This is when the Vikings started establishing long forts.
Long forts. And what exactly were those? Like camps?
Sort of. Fortified ship encampments is the usual translation. They were typically located strategically on rivers or coastal inlets, good places to moor their long ships. But these weren't just temporary stops anymore. They were bases built to last, often defended with ramparts. They allowed them to launch campaigns further inland and, crucially, to overwinter in Ireland, stay year-round.
And some of these long forts, they grew into something much more significant later on.
Incredibly so. Notable ones mentioned in the sources were founded at Dublin, or Dublin, the Black Pool, as it was known in 841, and also places like Limerick, Waterford, Wexford. These locations are absolutely key because many of them later developed into Ireland's first proper urban settlements, cities. The Vikings literally laid the foundations for Ireland's first towns.
Wow, so they moved from hit-and-run raids to setting up permanent bases. And the sources indicate the shift continued even further, beyond just having military camps.
Right. As the century progressed, the material shows a really fundamental transition. From being primarily raiders to becoming settlers, they began to establish a more permanent presence, putting down roots.
And what was the impact of this settlement? How did that change things?
It was utterly transformative for the island. They intermarried with locals, the Irish population. This created new kinship ties, new power bases, blurring the lines. They introduced new trade networks and goods, linking Ireland more directly into the wider Viking world, bringing coinage into wider use, maybe new technologies, new shipbuilding techniques, perhaps. And this led to the formation of what the sources sometimes describe as Norse Gaelic communities, a blend of cultures, languages, customs, something new that would become a permanent distinctive feature of the island, especially around the coasts.
But the Irish weren't just passively accepting this invasion and settlement, were they? The sources detail significant resistance. And also adaptation.
Oh, absolutely not. Passive is the wrong word entirely. The Irish kings and their warbands fought back constantly. The annals are full of accounts of battles, victories, defeats. The accounts describe periods where Irish forces would unite, temporarily at least, sometimes successfully, to expel Viking forces from certain areas or destroy their bases.
Is there a particular Irish leader highlighted in the sources from this time who, really fought back effectively?
Yes. Miles Secnail Mac Malibruned is mentioned quite prominently. He was a southern Uí Néill king who actually rose to become High King. And the annals record him launching successful campaigns, not just against rival Irish kings, because remember that internal competition didn't just stop because the Vikings arrived, but also specifically against the Norse invaders. He even drowned a prominent Viking leader called Turgesius, according to some accounts.
So there was active, significant military resistance. But the sources also point to a more complex response adaptation. What does that mean here?
Yeah, this is a really key insight into the pragmatism, maybe the opportunism of the time. While some kingdoms suffered terrible losses from the raids, others were remarkably adaptable. They didn't only fight the Vikings, get this. Some Irish kings actually hired Viking mercenaries to fight their own domestic enemies. Other Irish kings.
Hold on. They used the very people who were raiding them, these Viking warriors, to fight other Irish kings. That's incredibly shrewd, almost ruthless adaptation.
It really blurred the lines between foe and ally, didn't it? It shows the fluid, often brutal nature of power politics in this chaotic period. Pragmatism ruled, but despite all this trauma, all this disruption, the violence, Irish culture, Irish Christianity proved remarkably resilient.
How does the material demonstrate that resilience? How did it survive?
Well, the monastic scriptoria, for example, they continued their work. Even after monasteries were sacked, and many were, repeatedly they were often rebuilt. The monks kept producing manuscripts and, critically, kept maintaining the annals. As we discussed, these yearly records give us such unparalleled insight. They detail not only Viking attacks, but also, other events like comets, famines, those internal royal feuds we talked about, church disputes. They paint a picture of a society under immense pressure, yes, but still functioning, still adapting, and still recording its own history.
So, looking at the end of the 9th century then, what's the overall picture the sources present? How had Ireland been fundamentally transformed by, say, 900 AD?
The material makes it pretty clear that Ireland was a very different place than it was at the start of the century. The Norse presence was undeniable. It had introduced urbanization, those long forts evolving into proto-cities, new trade networks linking Ireland more directly into wider European, even global routes, and of course a permanent foreign element integrated into the population. Yet that resilience of the native Irish society is just as significant.
It wasn't just overwhelmed and replaced.
Far from it. The coming centuries would see this gradual integration continue. Norse Gaelic dynasties became established in the coastal cities like Dublin. Many Norse eventually converted to Christianity, adopted Irish customs, even the Irish language to some extent. And the Irish language itself absorbed Norse words, particularly for things related to seafaring and trade. The two cultures, despite the violence of their initial encounter, really began to shape a shared, though complex, identity on the island.
Okay, so to kind of sum up this deep dive then, Ireland in the 9th century, based on the sources we've explored, was this incredibly complex, dynamic place, a real pressure cooker.
Absolutely. A land caught right between continuity, the enduring systems of kingship, however fragmented, the vibrant monastic tradition, and this profound upheaval brought by the Norse. Constant tension.
It was defined by that unique, fragmented political landscape, that powerful, influential monastic tradition that was both spiritual and secular, and then the dynamic, often violent but ultimately adaptable response to the Viking incursions.
It was certainly not an age of peace. That's crystal clear from the records. But the material definitely shows us it was an age of persistence.
Yeah.
A real testament, I think, to the resilience of Irish culture facing both external storms and, let's not forget, internal strife.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the layers of history and how societies aren't static, even under immense pressure like that.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Consider how a society can not only withstand, but adapt to and even integrate elements of foreign culture, sometimes one introduced through pretty brutal violence, and how that complex, sometimes painful process ultimately shapes identity over not just decades but centuries. How much of that 9th century interaction